This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 553, part 2, entitled Masculists teach women to hate women who commit massive gender crimes against men. Carrying straight on. To bi-conscious masculists who are as familiar with feminist arguments, in brackets having read feminist books, as masculist arguments, since they are masculists, it's obvious that women oppress men worse than vice versa, due to the fact that so many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, and hence are more serious than the ways that men oppress women, which makes these gender crimes committed by women so hateable, since they are so horrible. For example, imagine the level of callousness of a woman, the level of gender criminality of a woman who commits paternity fraud against her boyfriend, partner, husband, lying to him that the baby growing in her is his, when she knows that it's not, that she is cheating on him in the sense she really wants the kid of a man who is well above her in SMV, that's sexual marketplace value, to get his superior DNA for her kid, so that her kid has superior DNA relative to hers. So she flatly, coldly, cynically, criminally lies to her partner. A few years later, the supposed father notices that the kid looks totally unlike him, so he gets suspicious and takes a hair sample of the kid to a paternity testing lab and learns that the kid is in fact not his. So he becomes extremely hateful towards his wife/girlfriend/partner, who has so brutally abused him in this hateful fashion. So he prosecutes her and puts her in prison for 15 years for her horrible, brutal, hated gender crime. Now, of course, such a crime does not yet exist on the statute books, since it will take the men's movement to create such an anti-paternity fraud law and to prosecute women who commit such decades-lasting gender crimes against men. To masculists, such crimes are truly hated, and masculists expect women to understand this hatred and to sympathize with men over this. If women don't, then these women will be dumped by masculisted men, being seen as unworthy of having relationships with masculisted men, seen by such men as being callous, feminazi cunts, hated, despised, rejected, cast out, annihilated. The fact that women have the mara, the maternity rejection right, yet men don't have the para, the paternity rejection right, merely shows how callous women are towards men, seeing men merely as cash machines to pay for women to have babies. The core idea of masculism is that it's a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, working for women for decades of a man's life. Women, thanks to men, now have a career window of half a century, so masculists put tremendous moral pressure on women to get off their fat parasitic asses and fip up, or are rejected by men. Men are getting really angry now, full of hate at what is happening to men, so are asserting themselves, causing the decade of the 2020s to be men's decade, comparable to the way that the late 60s and 70s were for women. Men are currently going through their consciousness raising stage that women went through in the late 60s. The feminists then moved on into feminist politics, getting laws changed, for example, equal pay for equal work, equal access to the professions, the establishment of family courts, in brackets, that was so toxic for men. the abortion right, that the Masculists call a MARA, fault-free divorce, and nearly got the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, in the USA. The Masculists and MGTOWs are currently in their consciousness-raising stage on the internet, but some of us are now pushing for the men's movement to move on into the next stage, that is, the political stage, as the feminists did in the 70s. The Masculists need to establish the GECs in the parliaments, which will then reform the divorce courts, throwing out alimony, giving custody of the kids jointly to both parents by default, scrapping the halving of wealth and stuff, using a principle of financial independence, so that divorcing wives are expected to be FIPs, and if not, then they will be poor, since they did not bother to FIP up, so must lie in the bed they made. These GECs will legislate the para, so that men have the same right as women to reject an unwanted pregnancy, so that if the mother chooses to continue the pregnancy to term, then she takes full financial responsibility for the costs of the kid. The fact that in today's world, millions of women can pill lie, telling their boyfriends/husbands that they are taking the pill when they aren't, get pregnant, then force a paternity suit on the father, thus manslaving him for decades to pay for a kid he never wanted in the first place. This kind of decades-lasting, massive gender crime by millions of women against men is another example of the real hatred Masculists have against such women. So we demand the legislation of the para, and will eventually go to war to get it if necessary. We Masculists have a real hatred of women whose attitude is that, quote, "Men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies," end quote. Masculists say to such women, quote, "If you really think that, if you are so callous towards men, so abusive and criminal, then in the limit we will kill you. Your behaviour towards men is so criminal, so hateful, so abominable, you become subhuman to Masculist eyes. If most women seem incapable of empathising with men in the men's hatred of such female abuse, then men will become increasingly bitter and hateful towards women, seeing women as behaving like severely selfish children. If that happens, then Masculists, then men, will simply take away women's right to vote, arguing that if women are genetically incapable of empathising with men regarding the horrible gender crimes that women commit against men, then men will see these women as irresponsible children and strip them of the right to vote, arguing that children do not get the right to vote. To those women who are reading this, do not underestimate the level of bitterness and hatred that is brewing in men as they raise their masculist consciousness, becoming increasingly aware how badly and how much worse women gender oppress men than vice versa. As millions of men masculist themselves, their collective hatred at women's decades-lasting gender crimes against men will only rise and rise to explosion point. If this happens, there will be a sex war in which the monoconscious feminist gender politicians will be assassinated, and thousands of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges will be murdered. What we are seeing now with masculisted men is the equivalent of the decades following the early abolitionists in the US in the 1830s and beyond, leading up to the US Civil War 3 decades later in the 1860s. There is growing hatred coming from men, masculisted men, as they wake up to how women oppress them far worse, committing gender crimes against men that last decades, that are so extremely callous, abusive and criminal that they deserve men's hatred. Some women will empathize with these hatreds coming from men, and will convert themselves into being female masculists, and will combine forces with the masculists to menfair the gender laws, and to help the masculists create a FIP society, in which all adults are raised and educated to be FIPs, so that today's hateable gender crimes that women commit against men die out. Those women who are incapable of empathizing with the hatred that men feel against the decades-lasting gender crimes that women commit against men will be severely punished. They will be hated by men. They will be rejected by men. And they will be exterminated by men, by being forced to rot on the shelf, utterly ignored by men, not even pumped and dumped. Within the decade, the moral pressure on women to become bi-conscious will be so powerful that millions of women will even, in capital letters, pretend to be empathetic towards men's oppression by women, rather than show their true feelings of female callousness towards men, through fear of being viciously rejected by men for being callous, manslaving gender criminals, so hated by men that they are forced to rot on the shelf, spat at, rejected, reviled, totally ignored. Female society will thus split into women who genuinely empathize with men's oppression by women, and those who only pretend to empathize. Men will soon learn to detect the genuine empathizers from the phonies, and still punish the phonies. Men, masculisted men, are now so angry, so full of hate, that things are now really moving. Political change is in the air, and women will have to adapt towards it, or they will die. They will be utterly rejected by men, most men, who within a decade will have been masculisted, taught by masculists about how women oppress men so badly. So hopefully my on-again, off-again girlfriend and her very blue-pilled son will convert themselves into a female masculist and a masculist. Otherwise, they're going to feel they have missed the train that will have left them behind. As most people become masculists in the coming decade, the way today most women, billions of them, have been strongly influenced by feminist ideas. Women have had their turn. Now it's men's turn. Feminists learn to hate the ways that men oppress women. Now masculists are learning to hate the ways that women oppress men. As part of that process, masculists also need to teach women to hate how women oppress men and to become female masculists. If women don't and remain monoconscious feminists, then in their millions they will not have a boyfriend. Since masculisted men will not go near a monoconscious feminazi cunt and will reject her by spitting in her face, treating her with hate that in the view of masculists she deserves. We live in interesting times. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man's Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 550 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.